I have talked before about Pastor John MacArthur. He is the leader of Grace Community Church in California. The reason I mentioned him, I think just a few weeks ago, is that he was talking about Martin Luther King Jr. And he said Martin Luther King was not a good Christian. He wasn't a Christian. John MacArthur called him a non-believer who misrepresented everything about Christ and the gospel. So that's John MacArthur for you. And we talked about that back in the day, so I'm not going to mention it here. But the reason I bring him up is because a couple of weeks ago, John MacArthur was speaking at a conference somewhere in California. It was called For the Valley Bible Conference. And there was a panel. And you know how, like, if you go to conferences these days, usually they're self-aware enough that if you have a giant panel discussion on stage, you shouldn't have all white guys, because isn't that weird today in the year of our Lord 2024? Like if you're at a tech conference or an atheist conference or what have you, and all you're seeing is white dudes up there, like conference organizer made a very big mistake, because I promise you there's no lack of other people you could have found. Anyway, I bring that up to say there was an all white dude panel because this is a Christian conference. And during their panel discussion, during the Q&A portion of it, somebody asked John MacArthur about a book he wrote not that long ago about a supposed war on children. And in that book, he basically says kids are all dirty, rotten sinners, because of course they are, those damn toddlers. And they eventually pass their sins down to their kids in the future, as if a sin was something on your genome. And so his whole point of the book is you got to deal with sin at an early age, right? What type of sins are we talking about? Well, he said, and I'm quoting here, the homosexuals say we are coming after your kids. I don't know where he got that quote from, because they're not, but okay. He also said companies like Disney were targeting children somehow. But then he said something else. He said he was reading another book. He just goes off on this tangent about another book he was starting to read, maybe as research into his book on children. But he said he was reading a book that explained how everything we know about mental illness is a lie. And guess what? It's not just him saying that. Psychiatrists and psychologists were finally admitting it, which is not true at all. But I'm gonna play for you about a minute of what he said, because it's very disturbing. And while you're watching it, notice the other white dude on the panel never saying, "Dude, you're wrong," just doing like a yes, wisdom. Okay, here's the clip.
There's no such thing as PTSD. There's no such thing as OCD. There's no such thing as ADHD. Those are noble lies. To basically give the excuse to, in the end of the day, to medicate people. And Big Pharma is in charge of a lot of that. If you understand, take PTSD for example. What that really is grief. You are fighting a war, you lost your buddies, you have a certain amount of survival guilt because you made it back, they didn't. How do you deal with the grief? Grief is a real thing. But grief is part of life. And if you can't navigate grief, you can't live life. But if you clinically define that, you can give them a pill, a series of medications, and they end up in LA homeless on the sidewalk.
I know. It's ignorance being passed off as wisdom. And the reason it gets to be passed off as wisdom is because everyone knows that dude on the panel as a man of God. So he could say whatever BS he wants. He's quite literally saying there that the pharmaceutical industry made up illnesses like post-traumatic stress disorder in order to sell drugs. And by diagnosing those illnesses, doctors were turning people into drug addicts and criminals. And again, there's so much good criticism you could have about the pharmaceutical industry, but I promise you they did not make up PTSD. They did not make up OCD or ADHD. And if there's medication available to treat those things, that's good and it works because, unlike what he said, PTSD is not just grief. Everybody grieves, everybody gets depressed, and there are ways to deal with sadness and depression, like basic depression and the loss of a loved one, something like that. We all have ways to grieve. We can all use that help. You don't need to turn to drugs to deal with that sort of grief. The things we are talking about, though, PTSD, things like that, no, it is much worse. If you ask trained, psychiatrists, psychologists, they could tell you what the symptoms are. I'm not trained in it. Don't ask me for the specifics, but there are specific things. It's about trauma. It's about that stuff recurring in your head all the time. To denigrate that and say, oh yeah, if a dude goes to war and watches his buddy die, and when he comes back alive and he constantly can't get sleep because he hears gunshots in his head or something, or you were the victim of assault and you keep seeing that over and over, that is not the same as like, I'm sad. It's not the same. Medication helps with that stuff. It's so irresponsible to say what that guy said. And it's not just utterly wrong, it is cruel and dismissive of everyone who has actually struggled with those conditions. And as you saw in that clip, and I'm not even cutting it off early, no one on that panel had a word of criticism for MacArthur. In fact, the moderator then wrapped up the session when he was done with that question by telling all the men, thank you for your wisdom. No bit of criticism there. Like, MacArthur, not a genius. His degree, by the way, is in theology, not psychology, not psychiatry, but he constantly acts like this armchair psychiatrist, pretending to be an expert in areas he knows nothing about. Honestly, it's impressive that he tried to criticize the pharmaceutical industry, and I'm on the side of the pharmaceutical industry for this one. Like, how are you making them look like the good guys in that clip? By the way, a little bit of a tangent, but I think it's an important one. The Christian reporter Julie Roys actually did research on his book, The War on Children, back in the day. And this is an interesting little side note. The War on Children was originally slated to be published by Thomas Nelson, a Christian publisher. However, after the Roys report, this website, published exposés revealing that MacArthur failed to protect child abuse victims and excommunicated a mother for refusing to allow her abusive husband back into her home, that agreement apparently fell through. Other Christian publishers also refused the book, so in March, that's March of this year, MacArthur self-published the book through his ministry. Which again, I'm not knocking self-publishing, but he published the book on his own, and he's now using the publication of that book to hamstring into this discussion of why PTSD is like a hoax. Just imagine when a Christian publisher refuses to work with you because you're too toxic. You know you have problems. A couple interesting additional notes here. One of the websites I was reading when I was looking up some of this stuff, it was from a guy named Adam O'Neill, his title is a psychiatric physician assistant. And he is not just a Christian and not just a conservative Christian, but the sort of conservative Christian who typically looks up to guys like MacArthur. But on his website, he actually wrote about this from a clinical perspective, criticizing John MacArthur. Here's what Adam O'Neill wrote. PTSD is not just grief. Grief is a painful thing. And PTSD is a painful thing. Sometimes they occur alongside one another, and other times they are not related. For those of us who have treated traumatic disorders, we can see both physically and mentally the impact of a traumatic experience on a person. And he says later, suffice to say here, OCD is more than anxiety, ADHD more than distraction, both in their genetic predispositions, neurological basis, and functional impact. They represent clear clinical entities for which treatments have produced great results. And that strikes me as the right answer. Like, that's someone who actually appears to know what he's talking about, challenging, to his credit, challenging John MacArthur for basically being an asshole. As for the line about how giving kids medications, if they need them, it'll turn them into like addicts or criminals, it is telling he didn't bring up any statistics to back that up. That's because there are none. He's making it up. He is a preacher. It is what he does best. Like, if you are struggling with mental illness, I hope you can see an experienced professional who can properly diagnose you and, if needed, give you the prescriptions you need. Because prayer is not going to help you by itself. The knowledge-free ramblings of an 84-year-old pastor who has honorary doctorates and nothing else are not going to help you. So I hope you get help from people who actually know what they're talking about. And by the way, if you're not familiar with John MacArthur, this is a guy who has a history of lying to Christians in the name of Jesus, and only 2 followers who accept everything he says as the gospel. He has previously denied climate change, saying, quote, God intended us to use this planet, and that it is a disposable planet. John MacArthur openly celebrated the lack of social distancing and face masks in his congregation during the height of COVID. He once crammed everyone into his church in like the summer of 2020 and told them, the good news is you're here, you're not distancing, and you're not wearing masks. And then in August of 2020, he said, quote, there is no pandemic. And then in October, there was an outbreak of COVID at his church. Haha, surprise. Oh, and he's also said, no one is gay. Like, he's a conspiracy theorist who gets invited to Christian events because of who he is. That's all he is. He doesn't have any other, what other worthiness does he bring to that panel? What wisdom is anyone getting from him other than he is a pastor who knows how to talk so that he sounds confident with what he's saying, even though he has no clue what he's talking about? You know what I mean? People should have stopped listening to him decades ago. Instead, a bunch of very unserious people keep propping him up to the point where he can get away with bigger, bolder, more dangerous lies. So for all this PTSD stuff that he said, the people we should be mad at are the Christian organizers who held this panel discussion and decided to make him a part of it. They're the problems here. MacArthur's the problem here. Everyone at his church in a position of seniority at his church who keep him in his position are part of the problem here. And the Christians who stand back because they don't want to offend John MacArthur or something, or they don't want to criticize him, are also part of the problem. Because if people don't go after this guy criticizing the stupid stuff he says, he's going to keep doing it. All right, going to pause there for a bit. We can talk about other stuff. Therapy. You give therapy, not just a pill. That seems accurate. It's never just medication. See you later. No, there's more to it than that. And that is part of the process of dealing with something like PTSD. Thank you for saying that. As someone who is pretty much entirely dependent on antidepressants to survive, fuck you, John MacArthur. Right there with you. Men like John MacArthur stand in the way of real help for people who need it, right? Like, I feel so bad for people who go to his church and probably struggle with mental illness, as so many people do. And they tell themselves, well, I don't need to see someone who knows what they're doing about this. I'm just going to pray for it to get better. I'm just going to treat my very real PTSD as grief and get over it. And then they struggle for years. I mean, we just talked about the story with Sarah, having been the victim of sexual abuse for so long, but people in her community did not know. They didn't know it was happening. They didn't know it was a thing. They were taught that women are supposed to be subservient, obedient. So no one did anything about it. And again, why is that happening? It's because the Christian leaders in charge tell you to think that way, and they're wrong, and it's dangerous, and no one has the courage to call them out on it. At least people of their stature don't have the courage to call them out on it. Not enough, anyway. Maybe a few people.